The municipal courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity as Sarah Thompson pushed through the heavy oak doors, her footsteps echoing across the marble floor. Despite being worth billions, she carried herself with an understated grace, wearing a simple charcoal sweater and well-fitted jeans. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and the only hint of luxury was a small pair of pearl earrings, a gift from her late grandmother. The security guard barely glanced at her as she passed through the metal detector, just another face in the crowd of people waiting to have their cases heard. Sarah took a seat in the back row of Courtroom 3, pulling out her phone to review the details of her parking violation. The ticket had been issued 3 weeks ago when she had parked in a restricted zone while rushing her elderly neighbor to the emergency room. Around her, the wooden benches filled with an eclectic mix of citizens, a young man in a wrinkled suit nervously adjusting his tie, an elderly woman clutching a folder full of documents, and a teenager with his worried mother. Sarah noticed how the court clerk's eyes lingered slightly longer on the people of color, a subtle reminder of the biases she'd faced throughout her journey to success. Judge Richard Bennett's reputation preceded him in Courtroom 3. Known for his stern demeanor and by-the-book approach, he had served on the bench for over 2 decades. The American flag behind his chair seemed to stand straighter as he entered, his black robe flowing behind him with an air of authority that commanded immediate silence. As Sarah waited for her case to be called, she observed the judge's interactions with other defendants. His tone shifted noticeably depending on who stood before him. Softer and more understanding with some, harsher and more presumptive with others. She made mental notes, her entrepreneur's mind already considering how technology might help document and address such disparities in the justice system. Case number 247, Sarah Thompson, the clerk called out. Sarah rose gracefully, straightening her sweater as she walked forward. Judge Bennett didn't bother looking up from his papers, his pen tapping impatiently against the bench. Little did he know that the woman standing before him had just closed a deal that morning that would revolutionize the tech industry, and soon, perhaps, the very system he represented. Judge Bennett finally looked up from his papers, his steel-gray eyes scanning Sarah with barely concealed disdain. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the frown lines that years of passing judgment had etched into his features. "Miss Thompson," he drawled, emphasizing each syllable as if speaking to a child, "you're here for parking in a restricted emergency vehicle zone. How do you plead?" Sarah stood straight, her voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, I acknowledge parking in the restricted zone, but there were extenuating circumstances. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, was experiencing severe chest pains and I had to. A simple guilty or not guilty will suffice." Judge Bennett interrupted, his tone sharp enough to draw disapproving murmurs from the gallery. "We don't need a story about your neighbor or whatever excuse you've prepared." The court clerk shifted uncomfortably in her seat, watching the exchange with growing unease. She'd seen this pattern before. The judge's quick dismissal of certain defendants, the subtle microaggressions that couldn't quite be called out but left a bitter taste in everyone's mouth. "In that case, Your Honor, I plead guilty but would like to explain the emergency situation that." "Miss Thompson." Judge Bennett cut in again, removing his reading glasses with theatrical slowness. "This court sees dozens of people every day, each with their own special story about why the law shouldn't apply to them. The sign clearly stated emergency vehicles only, unless you were driving an ambulance. Which," he paused, looking pointedly at her casual attire, "I seriously doubt. You were in violation." Sarah's expression remained composed, though her fingers tensed slightly at her sides. The young man she'd noticed earlier watched with sympathy, recognizing the familiar scene playing out before him. "Given your apparent disregard for emergency services and your reluctance to simply admit your violation," Judge Bennett continued, shuffling through his papers with exaggerated ceremony, "I'm imposing the maximum fine of $2,500. Perhaps that will help you remember that restricted zones are restricted for a reason. Do you need time to arrange payment?" The contempt in his voice hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the respectful tone he used with the previous defendant, a young white woman who'd committed the exact same violation. Sarah reached for her phone with unhurried grace, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The wall-mounted television in the courtroom, typically displaying public service announcements, suddenly switched to a breaking news alert. The volume was low, but the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen caught the court clerk's attention first. Breaking. Thompson Tech CEO Sarah Thompson becomes world's youngest black female billionaire after historic IPO. The clerk's sharp intake of breath drew others' attention to the screen, where Sarah's professional headshot now filled the display. The newsreader's voice cut through the growing murmurs. In a groundbreaking moment for Silicon Valley, Thompson Tech's innovative AI healthcare platform has achieved the most successful IPO of the year, with shares soaring over 250% in the first hour of trading. Judge Bennett's eyes darted between the television and the woman standing before him, his face cycling through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, the dawning horror of recognition. The reading glasses he'd been wielding so condescendingly slipped from his fingers, clattering against his desktop. "Miss Thompson," he stammered, his authoritative demeanor crumbling, "I had no idea that I could afford the fine." Sarah completed his sentence softly, her voice carrying easily through the now-silent courtroom. She held up her phone, displaying the payment confirmation for the $2,500 penalty. Or that the person you've been speaking to like a child has created technology that's currently revolutionizing healthcare accessibility in underserved communities. The young man in the wrinkled suit had his own phone out now, reading aloud to his neighbor. Thompson Tech's AI platform has already reduced diagnostic waiting times in rural hospitals by 60%. Sarah Thompson started the company in her garage just 5 years ago. Judge Bennett's hands trembled slightly as he shuffled his papers, desperately searching for something to do. The power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that the air itself felt charged with tension. The American flag behind him seemed to loom larger, a silent witness to the moment justice itself was being called into question. Sarah stood serenely at the center of the storm she hadn't created but had clearly anticipated. Her next words, spoken with quiet dignity, would set the tone for everything that followed. "Your Honor, I believe we need to have a longer conversation about how justice is administered in this courtroom." By sunset, the courthouse security footage had gone viral. The clips, captured on the official courtroom cameras and shared by multiple witnesses, painted a damning picture of judicial bias in crisp high definition. Social media platforms erupted with side-by-side comparisons of Judge Bennett's treatment of different defendants that morning, with hashtags #JudgmentalJudge and hashtags Sarah Thompson effect trending nationwide. The young man in the wrinkled suit, now identified as Marcus Chen, a law student, had posted a detailed Twitter thread recounting the entire incident. "I watched this judge dismiss a black woman's valid emergency explanation for a parking violation, only to literally drop his glasses when he realized she was a billionaire CEO. The implications are staggering." His thread had been shared over 100,000 times within hours. Local news vans clustered outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes reaching toward the darkening sky like mechanical flowers. Inside her downtown office, Sarah sat in a leather chair, watching multiple screens display different networks' coverage of the incident. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications, but she remained focused on the larger picture emerging. "We've received requests for comment from every major news outlet," her PR director announced, tablet in hand. "And the state's Judicial Review Board has already launched a preliminary investigation into Judge Bennett's past rulings." A team of data analysts have begun combing through 20 years of Judge Bennett's case records, revealing disturbing patterns in fine amounts and sentencing severity based on defendants' race and perceived social status. The numbers, displayed on a wall of monitors, told a story of systemic bias in cold, hard statistics. Sarah's personal inbox filled with messages from people sharing similar experiences in traffic court and beyond. One email particularly caught her attention, from Mrs. Rodriguez, her elderly neighbor whose emergency had led to the parking violation. "You turned an injustice into a spotlight for change," she wrote. "That's what real leadership looks like." Judge Bennett, meanwhile, sat alone in his chambers, his computer screen reflecting the growing storm. His secretary had already fielded calls from the Chief Justice's office, 3 civil rights organizations, and countless media outlets. The gravity of his actions, not just today, but throughout his career, was beginning to sink in, heavy as the robes he still wore. 2 weeks after the courthouse incident, Sarah stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the city's convention center. Behind her, a digital display showed the logo of the newly established Thompson Justice Initiative, featuring a balanced scale transformed into a digital circuit board. The room was packed with legal professionals, tech innovators, and community leaders, all drawn by her vision for judicial reform. "We could focus on a single judge's actions," Sarah began, her voice steady and purposeful, "or we could address the system that made those actions possible. Today, we choose the latter." She gestured to a row of monitors displaying real-time analytics of court decisions across the state, powered by her company's AI technology. In the audience, Marcus Chen, the law student who had documented the original incident, sat alongside Mrs. Rodriguez. Both had accepted positions on the initiative's Community Advisory Board, bringing their unique perspectives to the project. Mrs. Rodriguez dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Sarah outlined how the foundation would provide emergency transportation services to elderly residents needing medical care. "Our first project," Sarah announced, "is developing an AI-driven platform that analyzes court decisions for patterns of bias, making this data transparent and accessible to the public." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same technology that had made her a billionaire would now help ensure equal justice for all. Legal aid organizations across the city had already begun receiving funding from the initiative to support individuals facing court appearances. The foundation's mobile app provided real-time guidance, legal resources, and connection to pro bono attorneys. In its first week alone, it had been downloaded over 50,000 times. Local law schools partnered with the initiative to establish scholarships for students interested in civil rights law. Sarah had personally mentored Marcus in developing a curriculum about technological solutions to judicial bias, which would be implemented in law schools nationwide. The business community took notice too. Other tech leaders, inspired by Sarah's response, began examining their own roles in addressing systemic inequities. Several major companies had already pledged to match her initial $50 million investment in the initiative. Sarah concluded her speech by unveiling the initiative's most ambitious project, a virtual reality training program for judicial officers that would help them recognize and overcome their unconscious biases. "True justice," she said, "begins with understanding our own prejudices. Today, we start that journey together." Judge Richard Bennett sat alone in his study, surrounded by 20 years' worth of case files spread across his mahogany desk. Each manila folder represented lives he'd impacted, decisions he'd made, and now, biases he needed to confront. The data analysis from the Thompson Justice Initiative had laid bare patterns in his rulings that he could no longer ignore or explain away. His leave of absence from the bench had begun 3 weeks ago, following a tense meeting with the Judicial Review Board. The Chief Justice's words still echoed in his mind. "Richard, this isn't just about one incident. The numbers tell a story you need to understand." Today, he was preparing for his first diversity training session, not as a reluctant participant, but as someone who had requested the opportunity. The facilitator was Dr. Maya Richardson, a renowned expert in implicit bias who had initially been skeptical of his sincerity. "Most people come to these sessions because they have to," she had told him during their preliminary meeting. "Why are you here?" Bennett had struggled to find the right words, finally settling on the truth. "Because I need to understand how I became the very thing I swore to stand against when I first put on these robes." His journey took him beyond formal training sessions. He spent afternoons at community centers and neighborhoods he'd only seen from his car window. He listened to stories from families affected by biased sentencing, their experiences forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own prejudices. The most challenging meeting was with his own daughter, a civil rights attorney in another state. She had called him after seeing the viral video, her voice tight with emotion. "Dad, I've been trying to tell you about these issues for years. Are you finally ready to listen?" In his home office, a new edition appeared next to his law school diploma, a simple framed quote from Sarah Thompson's speech. "Justice is not just about following the law. It's about seeing the humanity in every person who stands before the bench." Each evening, Bennett documented his experiences in a journal, a practice suggested by his counselor. Tonight's entry began, "Day 23 of learning to be the judge I should have been from the start. Today, I realized that true justice requires more than knowing the law. It requires knowing yourself." The National Conference on Judicial Reform buzzed with anticipation. The grand ballroom of the Renaissance Hotel had reached capacity, with attendees spilling into overflow rooms to watch the live stream. At the center of it all, Sarah Thompson sat in the front row, her tablet displaying real-time analytics from the Thompson Justice Initiative's first 6 months of operations. Judge Bennett approached the podium, noticeably thinner than he'd been half a year ago, the weight of self-discovery evident in his bearing. The silence that fell over the room carried the weight of expectation. This wasn't just another conference speech. It was a moment of public reckoning. 6 months ago, he began, his voice steady despite his nervous hands. "I sat in my courtroom, wielding authority like a shield against understanding. It took a remarkable woman to show me that the greatest threat to justice isn't always the obvious wrongdoing. It's the subtle biases we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves." Sarah watched him intently, noting how different he seemed from the man who had dismissed her so readily in traffic court. The data on her tablet showed a 40% reduction in discriminatory sentencing patterns across courts that had implemented her foundation's monitoring system. "Ms. Thompson could have used her resources to destroy my career," Bennett continued, emotion creeping into his voice. "Instead, she chose to create something transformative. While I was learning to confront my biases in community centers and training sessions, she was building systems to prevent others from facing the same discrimination she experienced." He turned to face Sarah directly, departing from his prepared remarks. "The fine I imposed that day was $2,500. The lesson you taught me was priceless." The audience watched as Sarah rose from her seat and joined Bennett at the podium. Together, they unveiled the initiative's latest project, a comprehensive retraining program for judicial officers combining technological oversight with emotional intelligence development. "Change," Sarah addressed the crowd, "happens at the intersection of accountability and opportunity." Judge Bennett's journey proves that even deeply ingrained biases can be overcome when we're willing to confront them honestly. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for the speakers. It was for the promise of a justice system that could acknowledge its flaws and work systematically to correct them. In the back of the room, Mrs. Rodriguez clutched Marcus Chen's hand, tears streaming down her face. "Now that," she whispered, "is what healing looks like." 1 year after the traffic court incident, Harvard Law School's main lecture hall was filled to capacity. On the screen behind the podium, a split image showed the now famous courtroom footage alongside current statistics from the Thompson Justice Initiative. Professor Marcus Chen, newly appointed to the faculty, stood before the next generation of legal minds, using the case that had changed his own life to shape the future of judicial practice. "This isn't just a story about bias," he explained, gesturing to the data. "It's about how systems can change when we have the courage to confront uncomfortable truths." The students' laptops displayed real-time feeds from courtrooms across the country, where the initiative's AI monitoring system now tracked judicial decisions for patterns of bias. In state capitals nationwide, governors were signing bills mandating bias recognition training for all judicial appointees. The certification program developed by Sarah's foundation had become the gold standard, with courts proudly displaying their accreditation like badges of honor. The waiting list for the program grew longer each month. Judge Bennett, now a regular speaker at judicial conferences, had become an unexpected champion for reform. His journal entries had been transformed into a mandatory text for judicial training programs titled Blind Spots on the Bench, A Judge's Journey to Self-Awareness. The raw honesty of his writing resonated with colleagues who recognized their own unexamined biases in his words. Sarah's technology had evolved beyond monitoring. The latest version of the initiative software could predict potential bias in real time, quietly alerting judges to their own patterns before decisions were rendered. The system had already prevented thousands of potentially biased rulings, earning it the nickname the Justice Whisper among court staff. Mrs. Rodriguez, now serving on the initiative's board of directors, often shared how a simple parking ticket had sparked a revolution in judicial equity. Her hospital transportation program, inspired by her own experience, had expanded to 50 cities. In law schools across the country, first-year students began their studies with the Thompson case, as it had come to be known. But they learned more than just the facts. They experienced it through virtual reality simulations that placed them in both the judge's chair and the defendant's position, teaching empathy alongside legal principle. Sarah herself had moved on to new technological frontiers, but her foundation's impact continued to grow. The headlines that once read "Judge Finds Black Woman" had evolved into Thompson Initiative Certifies 1000th Bias-Free Court. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from tearing systems down, but from giving them the tools to build themselves back up better than before.